And thank you so much for coming back. I really appreciate it. Okay, so I was given the job of talking about research milestones in spasmodic dysphonia over 25 years, but I'm probably going to start even a little earlier than that. This is the organization that I'm going to use. I'm going to talk about research progress that has been done in the past in identification of the disorder. Then I'm going to talk about treatment of symptoms of the disorder, where we've been really concentrating, and what we've learned about the central neurological disorder in spasmodic dysphonia. Then I'm going to talk about what's going on now, what are the research topics that people are addressing. One, to come up with a diagnosis of the disorder, and then two, to identify risk factors that might begin to give us an idea of what might be the cause or contributing causes to spasmodic dysphonia. And then I'll end with our future research goals. Of course, we'd all like to know what the cause of the disorder is, or causes. It's probably going to be multi-causes. The treatment of the disorder itself, the central nervous system disorder, and then, of course, ideally, we could prevent the disorder and put the NSDA out of business. Yay! Okay, so identification of the disorder. I want to start back with Aronson, who published some papers in 1968 on the identification of the voice, the neurologic, and notice he also has psychiatric aspects, because one thing Dr. Aronson did was always emphasize the psychological aspects of spasmodic dysphonia. And in fact, he compared essential voice tremor and other neurologic and psychogenic dysphonia. So he was always looking at spasmodic dysphonia as one of a family, and really added the psychogenic aspect to it. However, we were saved by Dr. Amanoff, who noticed in 1978 that spasmodic dysphonia occurred along with a lot of other neurologic disorders, and that many of the patients with spasmodic dysphonia had other movement disorders, and he was the one that proposed that it was a neurological disorder primarily, and in fact only. Then we had the onset of the nerve section, and that was Dr. Dido, which was mentioned earlier today, in 1976. And he talked about the recurrent laryngeal nerve section for spastic dysphonia, which we now know as spasmodic dysphonia. And then after that, Dr. Aronson came back with the fact that the symptoms returned. This was then explained by Bjorn Fritzell in Sweden, who did EMG of patients where the symptoms returned after nerve section, and demonstrated that it was because of nerve reinnervation. And that's why the original disorder, which was in the central nervous system, began to appear again after the nerve reinnervated. Treatment of symptoms with botulinum toxin. Actually, the first paper was a very small 1 or 2 cases in the literature by Miller, and this included Gail Woodson, of using botulinum toxin in the vocal fold for spasmodic dysphonia, and then Dr. Blitzer and his colleagues on botulinum toxin injection for vocal fold for spasmodic dysphonia. We contributed the same time and talked about the fact that the symptoms that were changed primarily were the voice breaks in adductor spasmodic dysphonia. And then the only controlled trial, which is teeny, it only had 17 subjects, was done by Dr. Dan Trong, and that was published in Laryngoscope in 1991, and where they showed that the benefit primarily occurred in the patients who were treated with botulinum toxin and not those who had a saline injection. This is the kind of evidence that's usually needed to demonstrate a treatment effect, and ironically, we really don't have a lot of large clinical trials in spasmodic dysphonia. Then the SLAD surgery. Dr. Burke introduced the SLAD surgery, the selective laryngeal adductor denervation and reinnervation, a new surgical treatment for adductor spasmodic dysphonia, and Dr. Chetri then followed that up with a long-term follow-up in a larger number of cases in Laryngoscope, where they phoned the patients to see whether they continued to have benefit. So these kinds of treatments have raised different questions about what is spasmodic dysphonia. And the first was Dr. Dido, who posited that the abnormality was actually in the recurrent nerve, the nerve that innervates the muscles. And however, this was later not confirmed in two other studies. One by Dr. Ravitz in neurology in 1979 showed that there were no abnormalities in the recurrent nerve in people with in some post sections of people who had spasmodic dysphonia. And Dr. Chetri also did a very nice study of nerves and muscles in adductor spasmodic dysphonia and showed that there were effects of botulinum toxin in the muscles, but there was no nerve abnormality. So then if it's not in the nerve, where is it? And the first study that looked at brain function was done by Dr. DeVue, who was working with Steve Schaefer and Fran Freeman in the early 1990s and looked at cortical dysfunction. And here they found that there was decreased cortical activity in people with spasmodic dysphonia. Haslinger, 15 years later, we had to wait a long time for some brain studies in spasmodic dysphonia, then did functional MRI and showed that there was reduced sensory motor activation in the brain in patients with spasmodic dysphonia. So we had two studies, our first two studies showed reduced activity in the brain. However, since that time, we found the opposite. PET scan study that was done by our group at NIH found that there was increased activity in the sensory areas, and in fact, this was reversed a bit by botulinum toxin injection. So we have some disagreements about what's going on in the brain. Actually, if you go back and look at each one of these studies, the disagreements is probably whatever the patients were doing at the time that the study was done. In Haslinger, they were just saying a prolonged vowel, and we know some people don't have any symptoms when they prolong a vowel in spasmodic dysphonia. Whereas in the Alley study, they were talking in conversation and discussing what they had done in their childhood. So depending on what you have people do, they either have less activity for the prolonged vowel or more activity when they're using conversation, which we know is much more difficult for people with spasmodic dysphonia. So that's the problem with many of our functional brain imaging things. They only tell us what the person is, what the brain is doing to do that task. And so that's a problem in trying to interpret these results. So better to look at maybe structure and neurotransmitter abnormalities in the brain. And the first study there that I wanted to mention was done by Christina Semignon, published in Brain in 2008. And she looked at diffusion tensor imaging, which is a way of looking at the white matter cables that connect different parts of the brain together, and found that there was one area that had decreased nerve bulk in the internal capsule in the brain, going where you go from the cortical activity down to the brainstem, and found that on the right side only there was a decreased amount of nerve covering. She then, but that was only included one post-mortem study, as I mentioned earlier today. That same patient's post-mortem brain was used in the second study on the brainstem, as well as a patient with vocal tremor, and there was some pathology found in the brainstem. But again, these are just two people, and we don't know if they're representative and whether they might have had other problems that could account for the brain abnormalities. So we have some clues, but they really need a lot more substantiation. And then more recently, Christina Semignon did a PET scan study looking at L-DOPA, or dopamine, in the brain, and found that there was decreased dopamine expression in the brain in people with spasmodic dysphonia at rest, but then when they went to talk, they got increased. And that goes along with all the differences we found in functional MRI. Depending on what the person is doing, the amount of neurotransmitter or neuronal firing is going to increase or decrease. So this same result was found in writer's cramp too. In the same year, another study came out from NIH where people were writing and looked at the writer cramp patients, and they also had decreased dopaminergic firing, turnover rather, in the basal ganglia at rest, and increased when they went to write. So we're finding the same thing in other dystonias, but it's still hard to interpret exactly what that means. Okay, so now I want to turn to ongoing research, where people are looking at issues. Now, in 2005, which seems like it was ages ago, 9 years ago, we had a panel that looked at what was known about spasmodic dysphonia, and the first topic on the panel was, how do you diagnose spasmodic dysphonia? And we got stuck on that for a day and a half. And people are still stuck on it. And in fact, that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years, is working on this. So the Dystonia Coalition grant, which people have mentioned earlier today, we have Project 3, which is aimed at diagnosing spasmodic dysphonia. And what we found out was that the experts disagreed. And so we have developed a checklist, and we've sent this out to all the experts for input over the last 2 years, and we now have a checklist that we think clinicians could use for saying whether somebody has symptoms that are indicative of adductor spasmodic dysphonia, abductor spasmodic dysphonia, muscular tension dysphonia, or vocal tremor, or combinations thereof. We had a team of 13 people, lucky number, who developed this checklist, and then we went back to 45 people in the field and got their input. And we now have a one-page form, and I'm showing it to you so you can't read it. It's too small. And we're now trying to validate whether this is useful or not. And we're hoping that this could be the kind of checklist so that if you went to one center or another center, people would be looking at the same things to come up with a description of what your disorder is and to identify the type. Okay, now risk factors are really important because that's the first place we go in trying to get some indication of what might be causes or contributing to the cause. And Christine Tanner in Utah did a very nice study of comparing people with spasmodic dysphonia with other disorders and found that they reported more people with spasmodic dysphonia had cervical dystonia, had throat illnesses, mumps, rubella, dust exposure, and frequent voluntary voice use. Family history of voice disorders was also higher, and an immediate family history of vocal tremor and meningitis. I don't know what, meningitis is pretty rare. So, and then an extended family history of head and neck tremor. And I think this is to do with the high loading of people with spasmodic dysphonia who also have tremor. But clearly there's some family history of that. So this is an indication of where we need to go in looking at what might be contributing factors in the risk factors that might be contributing to risk for spasmodic dysphonia. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time on genetics because that's been the big emphasis lately, and I think it's a really important emphasis. We would like to know if there are genetic factors that make you more likely to have spasmodic dysphonia or not. And one of the things that's been proposed is that if you look at some disorders that are out there where spasmodic dysphonia is part of the disorder and where we find the mutations, then you would know what might be a possible genetic factor leading to spasmodic dysphonia. And there have been two types of dystonia in the literature recently where people have talked about people having a high number of the patients in the families having spasmodic dysphonia. And the first one is the THAP1 mutation, which is DYT6, and that's a generalized dystonia, but a high loading of these patients have voice involvement. And the people who initially described this called it spasmodic dysphonia. Dr. Ludlow subsequently looked at up to 1,000 patients with dystonia, and at least 300 of those patients had spasmodic dysphonia, and he found 6 cases that had this THAP mutation. And of those 6 cases, he said that several of them, that had laryngeal dystonia were like an abductor spasmodic dysphonia. And when they published this article, they provided a videotape of an example of one of these patients, and I just wanted to show that to you because it's not quite what I would call abductor spasmodic dysphonia. And hopefully we can hear this. I'm afraid. Okay, I want to point out that you don't all have hairy chests, but he's quite different from what I would call abductor spasmodic dysphonia. It's more of a whispering kind of sound, and he has a lot of other extra movements in his arms and things like that. So, one of the issues is when you have spasmodic dysphonia combined with other types of dystonia, it's a little different than the focal dystonia that we're talking about that most of you have experienced. Now, there's been another disorder where they found a genetic mutation, which they've also talked about possibly being spasmodic dysphonia. And this is called a whispering dystonia. This was first published in 2013, and they found the genetic mutation. However, a recent study has shown that this doesn't occur a lot in patients with spasmodic dysphonia, and I think Dr. Blitzer was a co-author on that, and indicating that it wouldn't be useful to test people with spasmodic dysphonia for this genetic mutation. And I want to show you one of these patients. And this patient comes from Australia, so try and listen not to the accent, but to the voice.
The puppy bit the tape.
Oh, puppy bit.
We mow our lawn all year. You have to? You stop.
Now, they can laugh, but the speech is very different, and there's a fair amount of what I'd call dysarthria, that is difficulty making speech sounds. So I think genetics is intriguing, but we really don't have anything that leading us directly to focal dystonia. Now, there are studies going on in New York. Christina Simignon has been doing working with Lori Ozelius on looking for people who have other members of their family with spasmodic dysphonia. And so that probably will be a better approach to go to than using these families who have whole body dystonia and also have the larynx affected. Now, treatment of the disorder is where we want to go. I mean, that's where, of the disorder itself in the brain. And there are only two possibilities that we have right now. One is deep brain stimulation that's been talked about. There have been series of deep brain stimulation in dystonia, and people have looked at those patients who also had larynx involved, and they found that the same has been occurring in Parkinson's disease. The deep brain stimulation doesn't help the laryngeal and oral mandibular aspects of these disorders. This may be because, as I think I mentioned, the larynx is different in that it's a midline structure innervated by both sides of the brain, and so it may be different in how it's affected by deep brain stimulation. But thus far, it doesn't look like this, from what we know in the centers that are being looked at right now for dystonia, are that helpful. But if you can stimulate in one part of the brain, you might be able to stimulate in other parts of the brain. And so I think we need a lot more imaging and studies to find out where to go for spasmodic dysphonia. Now, medications, it's also been mentioned, the medication study that's being done in New York, and they've been looking at a medication that's aimed primarily at tremor. And they published one case study earlier this year, or just the end of last year, where the patient had a spasmodic dysphonia and had a long-term effect of the medication. And of course, that's what you would want for a treatment. This medication is not something that you would take when you're going to be doing something that requires a lot of cognitive, because it can interfere with cognitive functioning if you take it too high. So you have to use it very judiciously. But what was interesting about this one case is that that patient took the medication and then had long-term benefits. So these are the inklings of where we should go. So where do we want to go next? We've been working on, we've done the first part, we're working on the second part, but our future research goals are for finding out what causes the disorder, how to treat the disorder in the central nervous system, and then of course how to prevent it. So that's a pretty big challenge. So please stay with the NSDA and continue supporting it, because NSDA does a marvelous job of going to Congress and arguing for research funds, and that role has been really important, because we've gone from just 1 or 2 grants being funded by the NIH to now 10 grants being funded by the NIH. So the NSDA is doing a wonderful job in ensuring that we will be able to address some of these things in the future. Okay, so we'll open this to the panel, and our 2 panelists are Dr. Blitzer and Dr. Blumin, and they may want to disagree with me totally, and so this is a time for them to do that. Okay, Dr. Blitzer? Oh, the microphone. Sorry.
So I applaud you. I think in a very short period of time, you really covered the major issues that are in the process of being addressed and need to be addressed. And clearly, with all the things that we talked about today, this is still a central nervous system disorder as best we can tell, and that we need to focus on the factors that have an implication in the functioning of the central nervous system, and how to address that, how to make it different. And then many of the things that we're talking about will become unnecessary.
I pretty much agree with everything that's been said. I have to applaud you for the coalition project to classify patients properly and attempt to create some standardization towards that effect. One of the main issues that was sort of discovered at the 2005 meeting was that we have all these interesting research ideas, but to get you patients sort of into the right group, we need to appropriately classify you, and we need a better system to do that. So the first step with the coalition project to really standardize our approach to listening to patients and to classifying patients is incredibly important.
I guess if people have questions, we'd really like you to submit some. Is any research being focused on the use of medical marijuana to alleviate symptoms? Well, so I did a lot of work in stuttering at one point, and in stuttering we found that some medications, if you made the patient feel better, their stuttering got better. And so probably if you feel better with marijuana, your spasmodic dysphonia may slightly get better, or you may feel it's getting better. But no, there hasn't been any research done on it that I know of to date. Dr.
I just wanted to see if there are any volunteers.
Okay, I had another question earlier that somebody asked about the role of trauma and spasmodic dysphonia, and they think they were addressing primarily post-traumatic stress syndrome and a disorder rather, and whether there's any evidence in the research literature about that. Not to my knowledge, I haven't seen, and clinically we haven't seen any cases either with post-traumatic stress disorder. We've certainly seen cases who have had brain injury who have developed symptoms like spasmodic dysphonia, but not as far as I know. Dr. Blitzer or Dr. Blumin?
No, I'm not aware. I mean, there are people that have psychogenic hysterical conversion reactions, and they have symptoms that appear to be SD. And many of those folks, if they are put into appropriate psychiatry and whatever, and get rid of the conversion disorder.
Hello, hello.
Oh, there you go.
So I'm not aware of any PTSD. The conversion reactions, I think, are different. Clearly, if this question was meant to be trauma, there are a lot of people that have brain trauma, car accident, stroke, other kinds of things that you can pick up on standard MRI where there's brain damage and can simulate the same symptoms or actually have dystonia from damage to the basal ganglia.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question. Any correlation with sleep apnea? Not to my knowledge.
Not to my knowledge.
Dr. Blitzer? No? Okay.
Sleep apnea is a common problem, though, so it's more common than
It
SD.
is,
Lot more
yes.
common than SD.
Yeah, we have to keep remembering SD is a very rare disorder, and many of the things that people talk about being related to spasmodic dysphonia, such as upper respiratory infections, stressful events, a lot of people have all those things, but they don't develop spasmodic dysphonia. So I think there's something.
So the other interesting thing is that sleep apnea, or moderate to severe and severe, are generally thought to be a lack of tone that occurs during REM sleep in particular, and so that the pharynx and tongue collapse and your airway gets blocked off. Dystonia, in general, when the basal ganglia are sleeping, most dystonic symptoms disappear. So that people that have SD, for instance, if they speak during sleep, they may have normal speech. Many of the dystonic postures that people have during the day may go away at night because the basal ganglia are functioning differently. And many people wake up in the morning thinking that they're cured, and then 5 minutes later, once the basal ganglia are functioning again, start having symptoms. And so for a long time, most of the dystonias, the focal dystonias, were thought to be psychogenic because they disappeared during sleep, not got worse.
Okay, so we have two questions that are terrific, and this is probably going to keep us going the rest of the day. One person wants to know what a home run research project would look like. Level of funding, subjects, duration, etc. And the other person wants to know, if you had unlimited funding, what kind of SD research would you do? Would you start with a large epidemiological study? What would you do? Okay, Dr. Blitzer, dream along. What would you do?
How much money are we talking about?
There's no limit here, so.
I mean, part of the problem, as you see through what we've been discussing today, is that right now we need to be global in looking at this disorder. And the reason is, just like the people that are looking for that missing plane from Malaysia, you have to go on the little bits of data we have, but you have to scan a big area because we're not sure where the money is. We know that it's a central nervous system disease. We know that there's some sort of lack of coordination of function. So there's a whole lot of things that we know about it. We know that there are some genetic pieces now that we can look at DNA. And so we still have to globally look at all of the pieces before we know which of the pieces that are going to fit together to give an answer. I think in the short run, if you only have a little bit of money, that's a very difficult problem, because we don't know exactly where to spend the money, where you're going to get the home run.
Dr. Blumin.
We were talking about in the back room earlier about different sorts of projects, and obviously to focus on the brain and different types of studies that we would do on the brain. But even so, as Dr. Blitzer just said, we're still looking at large areas of the brain, trying to find if there's one spot or multiple spots that are the problem. beyond that, we were talking about epidemiologic studies, looking at larger groups of patients and looking for some genetic markers. And again, with the Dystonia Coalition, hopefully there's some DNA that some of you have banked that we can start looking at and see if there's any comparisons that we can do between patients.
So there's lots of things that I would want to do if we had all the money. First of all, I think we do need to continue our effort on brain banking, because we only have 2 cases essentially that have been studied thus far, and it's very hard to know if those patients were representative of the rest of us. Probably not. So I think that that's something the NSDA has started and made a very good effort to set up a system so that people can send their brains to Harvard, and since it happens after you've died, it's painless. But I do think that it's something that would be a great contribution. The 2 brains that we were able to get were, increased our knowledge in that area by 100% because we had nothing before. So, you can have a big impact that way. Epidemiological studies were mentioned. Epidemiological studies have been done a little bit, but we certainly haven't done a comprehensive epidemiological study. I don't know how much a large population-based epidemiological study will really get us the answers. I'm more interested in following people over time, maybe who are in high-risk families, and try and understand how spasmodic dysphonia develops, maybe doing brain imaging before symptoms begin to be shown so that we know what is the disorder without the symptoms, because that would be really helpful. Certainly, we need clinical trials to look at comparing botulinum toxin with surgeries, with medications. We have that small one little TRONG trial of 17 patients in botulinum toxin, and we have some uncontrolled follow-up of surgery patients. But here's where I think the NSDA could really contribute a lot, to have a voluntary network where people who have treatment could almost call in once every 6 months or so and answer some questions, and so that we would be able to track their voice changes over time. That was something we were discussing today, and that's where patients could really contribute a lot of follow-up. Because what happens is they go to have the surgery or the Botox, and people don't, and if they get better, people don't see them again. If they get worse, they see them again, but we don't know if people get better. And so we don't have the positive results. Okay, so those were just some of my thoughts. Any research on L-DOPA responsive SD? No, I think that, Andy, those were intriguing cases.
Yeah, I mean, the DOPA responsive cases, to my knowledge, and I may be incorrect, I'm not aware of another primary SD patient with nothing else that's DOPA responsive. And I don't know that this patient is yet, but we'll find out. They at least have the gene deletion. It's thought to be a syndrome, really, of more generalized dystonia. But I believe someone told me that there may be one case of writer's cramp that was DRD, and I'm still looking in the literature to see about that. But so it's not because we found that all of you should run out and have genetic testing and start taking Cinemat, but it shows that these were previously thought not to exist. And they do. As we begin to have better tools and more information, we'll be able to have more precise kinds of therapies that are suggested, rather than right now it's kind of hit and miss. You try this and try this and try this, and maybe something will work. Soon we'll be able to target what the deficiency is in the brain, or what there's too much of, and give you a drug that works on that. And whether that's based on some functional brain scanning, or whether it's based on a genetic profile, we don't know.
Yeah, we clearly need the brain imaging and the genetics and the symptoms all measured together. The next question, worldwide, who is doing research on spasmodic dysphonia? Well, we have a fair amount in this country. As I mentioned, there's at least 10 grants being supported by the NIH. There is a fair amount of research in England, and that there's some projects there looking at DYT1, which is another mutation, and comparing that with spasmodic dysphonia. And I would very much like to hear the results of that. There's people in Germany who have been doing genetic studies in spasmodic dysphonia and other dystonias. Do you want to add to that?
Well, there's still continued work with that Australian family.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
a one family with the DYT4 gene, which is interesting, and why it's only that population is unclear, and it's kind of a bizarre presentation. But it may also give maybe some more information about where in the brain this may be happening and why is it affecting them different than the cases that we see. And in Japan, there are a few researchers, Dr. Kobayashi and others and Ryuji Kaji, the neurologist in Tokyo, who are working on dystonia more in general, but they also have cases of SD, and they're trying to put together the same kinds of things that we are.
It's interesting because years ago we thought that spasmodic dysphonia didn't happen in Japan, and now we know that it just wasn't being diagnosed. So it really depends on the knowledge of the people seeing the patients. Let's see. Any research on the relationship between familial essential tremor and SD? If so, how is this information being used to benefit offspring? Familial essential tremor is looked on as a fairly separate disorder, and I've seen familial essential tremor run in families, and clearly you can, often you'll see grandmother, mother, and daughter, those sort of pathways of inheritance. But that seems to be separate from spasmodic dysphonia. We don't see the same pattern in spasmodic dysphonia. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think the overlaps that people see is because essential tremor is a rather common disease with a late onset. So spasmodic dysphonia in our group, the average age was somewhere around 40. In essential tremor, the average age is probably around 60 to 65. So it would not be uncommon to have dystonia, and then when you get a little older, also have essential tremor, because it's a much more common disorder that may happen anyway. A lot of people think that it's normal for old people to shake, but that's not true. It's just that older people get essential tremor, and so they shake. There is a gene for the familial essential tremor that can be identified, and it was what Katharine Hepburn had, where her father, brother, and she all had essential tremor. And on Golden Pond, you can see the results of her hand, head, and laryngeal tremor. So it would not be uncommon to have both. And I have a patient that from a young age, in her mid-20s, ended up with both tremor and spasmodic dysphonia. Her father had dystonia, had blepharospasm and torticollis, and she's DYT1 positive. Her mother had essential tremor. Her grandmother had essential tremor, and she has the gene for essential tremor and has tremor. And as she's gotten older, the tremor has gotten worse, which is what happens in many people anyway. It's not because she has both disorders.
But that's pretty unusual.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, do you have any estimate of the percentage of people that have SD that actually get diagnosed with SD? I think that's something, of course, we don't know. You'd have to go from door to door, examining everybody in a whole area to know how many people actually have spasmodic dysphonia. It really depends on people who want to do something about their voice and how important their voice is. And I've run into people in grocery stores and things like that who clearly have spasmodic dysphonia, but I don't go up and ask them if they know that they have spasmodic dysphonia. So I think it's something that unless we had a lot of people going door to door that we could find out the answer.
It does seem like that the time to diagnosis has been improving over the last 10 or
Yeah.
15 years. It used to be, it seemed like every patient had a 2 to 3 year or more cycle of going doctor to doctor, psychiatrist, et cetera, before they found somebody that identified their problem. Now it's a year. So it seems like it's a lot better.
And in fact, sometimes other disorders are diagnosed as spasmodic dysphonia. So I think the NSDA has done a terrific job from that point of view. How can we encourage clinical trials? Write to your congressman. Because clinical trials are very expensive. The kind of little study that Dr. Trong did in 17 patients doesn't really have evidence that impacts the medical delivery system. You need a large clinical trial, and usually a large clinical trial across many different centers. And so that would cost about $10 million. And so the question is, what would you want to evaluate in your clinical trial? Would you want to evaluate the effects of Botox? Would you want to evaluate the effects of surgery? I discussed earlier how we might set up a tracking system so that people who are undergoing treatment for spasmodic dysphonia can call in and answer some questions and provide us with some informal data on what their treatment effects are, because we really need that before we design a big clinical trial. We need to know what parameters to look at and what's important. Did you want to add anything there?
I was just going to say that I think, you know, under sequestration, the monies for certainly from federal grants are really limited, and so that if you all can put some pressure on your duly elected representatives, who in Washington seem to be doing nothing, and have them appropriate money to where it belongs, so that we can go ahead and try to answer these questions rather than worry about intra-party bickering, that it may go a long way, because we can only do so much, and the rest of the people, you know, it's up to you who elect these people to tell them what they need to do. Because if the NIH has more money, which some more of the basic research has to come from that, because now in the industrial money is drying up. Universities don't have it anymore, except for some marginal grants that are given here and there. And if we depend on industrial money, industry wants to know what return, their stockholders want to know what return are they going to get for doing this trial, which may help to sell product and it may help to develop better products, but it doesn't help us understanding fundamental problems in diseases. And the only way to do that is to have monies available to universities or to investigators or the NIH itself to look at these things. But when the federal government doesn't appropriate money, all of that just ends.
And the problem with spasmodic dysphonia, as you know, it's an orphan disorder. That is, it's a rare disorder. And so pharmacological companies and other companies are not going to invest in treatment. So we really depend on NIH, because the commercial companies are not going to make any money by finding a treatment for spasmodic dysphonia. They want something that affects millions of people. And so that's why writing to your congressman or your senator is so important for encouraging research. Now, I have 3 more questions on marijuana. What's going on in here? One patient had
You got to hold this meeting in Colorado next year.
Obviously, yes. No, it's all different. I don't know what's going on. Somebody went in and had marijuana from Dr. Aronson many years ago and said that their voice changed. Somebody else wants to know why marijuana was not used by the NIH. Having been there, I can tell you why. And they wanted to know why dextromethorphan was investigated at NIH and not marijuana. Well, that was because of animal studies, and animal studies are really important. We don't have an animal model for spasmodic dysphonia. Find me a rat who has voice breaks. So that's a problem in trying to develop a basic research for our disorder. But it will help. Animal studies will be very helpful. The reason dextromethorphan was interesting is it's one of the neurotransmitters that's involved in changing reflexes in the larynx, and so that's why I investigated it. I don't know whether marijuana changes the reflexes in the larynx, but that would be the place to start. That would be cheap, and you could have some happy rats. So I think that, you know, many of these questions, we need to think of whether there's good basic studies that could be done first, because they're much less expensive than going to large clinical trials and patient studies. Okay, we are moving along here. I think I've just about answered all of the questions. Are there any more? Yes.
How hard would it be to actually create a knockout model in mice for the DYT gene defect?
Oh, they have them already.
Then we do have a model, or it doesn't produce clinical?
Doesn't produce, and of course, you know, rats use ultrasonic sound to, and we can't hear that, but we can record it. But there are several animal models for dystonia. Some involve the cerebellum, and that's to do with the whole motor regulation system and balance and other things like ataxia. So there are animal models for cerebellar disorders showing that you can animals can develop dystonia from that. The DYT one, there are nice mock-up models for that. But unfortunately, we just don't have speaking rats.
Well, but even beyond that, we know that even in human, you can demonstrate the gene, whether it's DYT1 or DYT6. These are mostly autosomal dominant genes, but with variable expressivity. It can skip generations. The response to having that gene is variable even within the same family. And so to think that you're going to have one animal, and for some things you can do this, some diseases you can do it. I think for this would be very difficult. There's not even a good one for generalized dystonia.
Right. Yeah. The DYT one is a very selective model. So we really need a lot of work to examine that. One of the things I wanted to mention that spasmodic dysphonia, because we don't have people who have problems with crying or laughter, that suggests that the system that animals have for vocalization is not affected, because people have no difficulty crying and laughing and shouting, but it's speech that's affected. And speech is a separate vocalization system that's in humans, but not in our animal models. And so that's the other difficulty that we have. We need a speech model to break down rather than something that affects vocalization for emotional expression. SD literature is in laryngoscope. Where else? I listed each one of the journals that published the articles that I was referring to, and I wanted to show you that it's primarily in the speech and hearing literature, the otolaryngology literature, and the neurology literature. And so those are the three sort of groups that have been doing research on spasmodic dysphonia. And I do think it's very important for us to involve our colleagues from neurology because they have the work on the brain and the different techniques for studying the brain and how it might be changed in spasmodic dysphonia. So we try and involve neurologists in our research teams, and I think that's very important.
Anybody can access the National Library of Medicine PubMed database by just Googling PubMed. You can also go to Google Scholar and look under spasmodic dysphonia and get all the hits if you are interested in looking yourself.
So any of those studies can be accessed by all of you. Okay, are we done our job here? I wouldn't want to keep you from the cocktail.